Hello, my name is Ellen Owens, and I live in Cincinnati, Ohio. I have been listening to Diane Rehm for years, and I've been listening to the podcast from the beginning. Diane is a breath of fresh air. She is a truth teller, and she lowers my anxiety level. Support Diane's ongoing work with a gift today at dianerehm.org/donate.
Hi, it's Diane. On my mind, what to do about Russian aggression? That's the question facing the Biden administration and its European allies as the Ukraine crisis continues. On Thursday, the Kremlin announced it was pessimistic the West would meet its demands in the standoff over the country's military buildup at the Ukrainian border. Meanwhile, President Biden warned of enormous consequences and direct sanctions against Putin if Russia launches an invasion. Angela Stent is a former national intelligence officer for Russia and Eurasia and author of the book Putin's World, Russia Against the West and With the Rest. She says this is a crisis 30 years in the making, and understanding Vladimir Putin's broader goals is key to finding a solution. Angela Stent, tell us where things currently stand in these escalating tensions between the U.S. and Russia as you and I are speaking here Thursday afternoon.
So yesterday, the United States delivered responses to the demands that Russia had made essentially on December 17th, proposing two treaties, one with the US, one with NATO. But the bottom line there was to promise that Ukraine would never join NATO, and also that NATO would pull back its troops and equipment to where it was in 1997, which is really the same as it was when the Soviet Union collapsed before the first round of NATO enlargement. And of course, we don't know exactly what was in the response, but if we listen to Secretary of State Blinken and the Secretary General of NATO Stoltenberg, they both said, we are very happy to discuss with the Russians things like arms control, troop maneuvers, maybe revive the Treaty on Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces, but we are not going to accede to these two basic Russian demands. And so far, we've had the Russian foreign minister today, Thursday, say that, yes, we've read these responses. They're not adequate. They don't respond to our demands, but there's maybe some room for discussion, and now it's with President Putin. And there's one other, I suppose, hopeful sign, which is that the so-called Normandy format, that is, the French, Germans, Ukrainians, and Russians had a meeting in Paris to talk about the Minsk Agreement, which is the 2015 agreement that sort of ended the first phase of the war in southeastern Ukraine. And they have agreed that they're going to meet again in 2 weeks in Berlin to talk about implementing this agreement, which has to do with Russia withdrawing its troops from the separatist regions and the Ukrainians having elections in these regions for a new legislature. So that's where we are now. Now the ball is in President Putin's court, and we're waiting to see whether there will be more diplomacy, whether there will be more talks, or whether there will be an escalation in the military conflict.
It's interesting that last point you made about Germany, because thus far, Germany has not been or seemed to be very forthcoming in terms of assisting Ukraine. They sent helmets to Ukraine, which seemed to be rather insulting to the Ukrainians, after all. Do you see this last measure now as a sign that Germany may be rethinking its position toward Ukraine?
I think what the Germans don't seem willing to rethink is what they claim is embedded in their constitution, that they don't want to provide weapons to war zones. And they go back to their history. And obviously, we go back to the World War II history, the invasion of the Soviet Union by Nazi Germany, and 26 million Soviet soldiers who died in that. Of course, 6 million Ukrainians died as a result of the German invasion. So it's not only Russians who died, but their point is that they don't want to exacerbate any war zone. And they've even gone so far as to say that Estonia, which has some howitzers that used to belong to the GDR, the East German regime, which are quite old, obviously. The Germans wouldn't even let the Estonians give these to the Ukrainians because they have obviously German components in them. So I don't see Germany revising, that part of its view of what's happening in Ukraine. On the other hand, the Germans, are supporting the Ukrainians. They're trying to find some settlement, but we have a new government in Germany, and it's really quite divided on how to deal with Russia. The foreign minister, who comes from the Green Party, which is much more tough on Russia, wants to take tougher action. And Robert Habeck, who is the head of a big economics ministry now, he in fact has said that Germany should supply weapons to Ukraine, but he's in the minority. But the Social Democratic Party and the new Chancellor of Germany, Olaf Scholz, is a Social Democrat. They have traditionally been much more forward-leaning towards Russia, and they would not be willing to consider any kind of military assistance.
These issues with Ukraine and Russia really go back to 2008 and promises made back then by NATO.
Yes. So in 2008, the Bush administration, the George W. Bush administration, was trying to get its NATO allies to agree that a membership action plan would be offered to Ukraine. And that's a plan which would eventually involve membership, but it's a plan really to prepare a country to join. But the major allies, Germany and France particularly, were against that. And when they got to Bucharest, the NATO summit in Bucharest, there was an all-night session where they were trying to hammer out a compromise on that, because the Germans and the French and some other NATO members did not want to give this membership action plan to Ukraine.
Why?
Because they thought it would provoke Russia. Germany, again, was very concerned about its historical relationship with Russia. Both the Germans and the French believed that the prospect of Ukraine joining NATO would provoke Russia. Now, not all members agreed. I mean, the Poles, for instance, the Baltic states wanted to have Ukraine and still want to have Ukraine in NATO. So that was the problem. And they came up with this compromise language, which in retrospect was very unfortunate, because what they said was Ukraine and Georgia will join NATO. But there was no timetable. There was no plan as to what that would mean, how they would get there. And so in a way, it was the worst of both worlds, because from a Russian point of view, they can point at that and say, look, it's in black and white on that piece of paper, Ukraine will join NATO. Whereas the Western side could say, well, this is a very vague promise. It means one day. And the reality is, and President Biden has said that, Ukraine is not in a position to join NATO now. This is not something that's on the table. Maybe eventually, sometime down the road, it will be ready, but it's not an actual issue. The Russians actually know that. But of course, they can point to this document and say, this is what worries them.
In a new piece in Foreign Affairs magazine, you argue that this is actually, quote, a reckoning that has been 30 years in the making. Talk about that, if you would.
So when the Soviet Union collapsed and then the Warsaw Pact, the Soviet alliance had also gone, the question was, what was going to happen to European security? And of course, most of Russia's neighbors, we're talking now Poland, the Czech Republic, Hungary, a lot of those countries had historically been dominated by Russia, the Russian Empire, and then the Soviet Union, and they wanted to break free. They wanted a guarantee that, for instance, Poland could be a truly independent country. The other thing that was going on then was that there were countries, well, Hungary and Romania had a major territorial dispute, Transylvania, which the Hungarians say really belonged to them. This goes back to World War I. So there were a number of disputes in Central Europe. And when the United States and its Western European allies looked at that, they thought, how can we make sure that there is not another armed conflict that breaks out in Central Europe? You know, they were worried about, for instance, Romania and Hungary. And they thought the best way is to embed these countries in the NATO alliance. Now, the European Union, all of these countries wanted to join, but that obviously took much longer. But NATO membership wasn't as complicated. And these countries wanted to join NATO. So the decision was made that it was more important to ensure the security of these countries and that there not be any more conflict in Europe than to listen to the Russian arguments, which were NATO should dissolve, we should have a new system in Europe where Russia is included. And so the fundamental problem in the 1990s was that, if you like, a system evolved where the Russians really had no stake and very little input. They were outside of this. Now, at the very beginning, President Putin said to President Bush, you know, Russia would like to join NATO. Is there a possibility? And there were some thoughts that could happen. People started to write about that, but it didn't happen. And so the crucial question of where does Russia belong in Europe, what's its role, was never resolved. And that's what we're seeing now. We've had NATO that's expanded to include the Baltic states, to include much of the Balkans, etc., but not yet Ukraine, no other post-Soviet state. And this is what Putin is trying to stop now. Again, not that there are any plans on the books for NATO to enlarge anymore, but this is what it's come to. We're with a system where Russia really doesn't have a stake in a peaceful order in Europe that was constructed after the collapse of the Soviet Union.
And Putin indeed would like to renew some sense of the Soviet Union as it was. And when President Trump came in, there you have Trump saying NATO is worthless and buying into the whole Putin idea.
Yes. So, I mean, from the Kremlin's point of view, this was a gift to them to have a President Trump who denigrated NATO. If you read Ambassador John Bolton's book, it looks as if the US came very close to pulling out of NATO. Not that President Trump could have done that unilaterally. The US Congress would have had to be involved. But he, at some point said he wanted the US to leave NATO. And plus, he denigrated really the US as one of its most important allies in NATO, namely Germany, the way he treated Chancellor Merkel. So from the Russian point of view, this, as I said, was a gift. But of course, it didn't happen. And really partly as a result of this, now the Biden administration has doubled its efforts to try and improve, restore transatlantic ties, improve them, work together with the Europeans. But one has to acknowledge, the Europeans are now wary. They've seen what happened, in the past 4 years. They don't know who's going to be president in 2024 and what's going to happen again. And therefore, even though they're very pleased that the transatlantic alliance has been restored, they're not sure how long that's going to last. And Putin understands that as well. So this is a time for him to try and say to the Europeans, are you really sure that the United States, has your back? Because one of his ultimate goals would be to get the United States to leave Europe, to sever those transatlantic ties.
So what you're saying, what I hear you saying, is Putin discerns weakness on the part of the United States and believes that this is the time for him to make his advance into Ukraine, because the United States, number one, doesn't want to go to war. Number two, the NATO alliance is in and of itself perhaps not behind the United States in going to the defense of Ukraine. So Putin thinks, why not?
Exactly. I mean, this is his moment. He's turning 70 this year. He's been in power 22 years. Maybe he's thinking about his legacy. And he looks around him. He looks at a United States, we're riven by our own political divisions, polarization, an administration struggling to get through its agenda. Also, an administration that would have liked to have focused on China as the major adversary. Well, Putin's made sure that that's not happening. They came in saying we want a stable and predictable relationship with Russia. The last time when Russia began to amass troops on the border with Ukraine in April of last year, that resulted in President Biden suggesting a summit with President Putin, which they had in Geneva. And what President Biden said was, let's wait 6 months to see the results of this. Well, we see what the results are, and there's no stable and predictable relationship. So he senses weakness in the United States. The Russians look at what happened with the withdrawal from Afghanistan, and they take some conclusions from that, that this is an administration that really doesn't have its foreign policy act together. And then they look at the Europeans, and as we've said, you have a new German government that's divided on what to do. In France, President Macron faces re-election. He's very much focused on that. All of these European countries are dealing with COVID and the economic consequences thereof. And so this looks like a good moment to act. Plus, the Kremlin had some hope when Ukrainian President Zelensky came in. He was a novice. He said he wanted to make peace with Russia. They thought that he'd be more accommodating. Well, he's become much less accommodating. Also, his popularity numbers are down, and they've been down for some time. So maybe they also sensed this was a time to put a lot more pressure on Ukraine and maybe get a government there that was more favorably inclined toward Russia. Plus, I think we have to remind ourselves that Europe is in a tight energy crunch at the moment. The energy prices have gone up. This is great for Russia. And Putin has leverage. Europe gets about 40% of its natural gas from Russia. So this is also an area where he can put some pressure on them.
Now a quick break. When we come back, more of my conversation with Angela Stent. And we're back. Here's the rest of my conversation with Angela Stent. She's Senior Non-Resident Fellow at the Brookings Institution and a former National Intelligence Officer for Russia and Eurasia. Her most recent book is titled Putin's World. So what about these sanctions that President Biden and the U.S. are threatening to impose on Russia if indeed it makes an incursion into Ukraine? Any kind of incursion, small or large, how effective could sanctions be?
Well, you raise an important point, of course, which is the difference between something that's limited and something that's more widespread. And President Biden got a lot of criticism for suggesting last week that if it were a more quote unquote minor incursion, the sanctions would be different. But in fact, what he said is realistic. If, for instance, you had Russia going back, well, not that it's left, but if you had official Russian troops going back into the Donbass region and taking a little more territory, for instance, causing some more problems there, using cyber, whatever, would that evoke the same reaction as sending troops as far as Kiev? And I think we all know that the answer to that is no. But let's take the scenario that there is a more full-fledged military incursion. What sanctions are being threatened? Well, from the US point of view, we've talked about ejecting Russia from the international payment system, SWIFT. The issue about that is if they were thrown out of this system, this affects a lot of other countries that do business with Russia, including our European allies. And it also probably would push Russia and China closer together to develop an alternative payment system, which they're already beginning to do. Then there is talk about sanctions really on Russia's industrial base, that we wouldn't export semiconductor components to Russia anymore, which they don't produce themselves, that we would try and ban or sanction countries and companies that do business with Russia in the energy field. These are very wide-ranging sanctions. President Biden also talks about sanctioning Putin, personal sanctions against Putin. So that gets into the question of, you're not going to find bank accounts anywhere which have the name Vladimir Putin on them. So that involves a lot of investigations, let's say. So these are, on the face of it, very, very tough sanctions. But Russia has now amassed over $600 billion in foreign currency reserves. It would not immediately be that adversely affected by sanctions. If there are just some key Russian banks that are sanctioned, that would be a problem for the Russians. And then the other issue is, how much would the Europeans go along with these sanctions? The energy sanctions, would they really support sanctioning the entire Russian energy industry? Not unless there were alternative sources of energy. We hear now that the Biden administration is working with other countries to try and figure out what alternative sources could be provided were Russia to shut off the gas tap. So it's not clear that any of this so far has been a deterrent. And it's also not clear that there is unity on these sanctions. And we always have to be careful, the US, when we impose sanctions, that they don't affect our allies more than the country that we're trying to sanction.
Indeed. And what about members of Congress in this country? How are they supportive or not supportive of tougher sanctions, greater measures attempting to deter Putin?
With all the polarization of this country, one issue where there seems to be a lot of agreement in Congress is getting tough on Russia. And so you've had a bipartisan consensus on sanctions really going back to 2017. Now, having said that, there is a wing of the Republican Party, a Trump wing of the Republican Party, I guess exemplified by Tucker Carlson and other people on Fox News, that actually supports Russia and says Ukraine is not a national security issue for the United States. We really shouldn't be worrying about it. Russia is a country with whom we should have better relations. There's a wing of the Trump Republican Party that likes Putin, that, he's a strong man. The more white supremacist wing of the Republican Party thinks that Putin, Stephen Bannon once tweeted that, is the quote unquote savior of the white race. So there's a whole, I don't know how many people we're talking about, but there is a wing that is pro-Putin. But the majority of people in the US Congress in both houses do support tough measures against Russia. And some Republicans, of course, have criticized the Biden administration for not going far enough. So I think there will be enough consensus on this.
Angela, what about Russia's success in challenging U.S. authority elsewhere outside of Europe? What about Japan, for example? What about Cuba? What about Venezuela? What are we seeing in other parts of the world?
So certainly, one of the things that we've heard coming out from the Kremlin recently is that if the U.S. continues to support Ukraine and send, non-lethal defensive weapons and things like that, that Russia will then think about deploying similar weapons in Cuba, in Venezuela, and some of the other Latin American countries. We've already seen Russia, of course, supports the current Cuban regime. It really has enabled Nicolás Maduro to stay in power in Venezuela. And you have more and more governments in Latin America now that are electing leaders that are much more sympathetic to Russia. And so Russia has been acting, if you like, as a spoiler, I think, particularly in the Venezuelan case, in the last few years. And then, the Russians have been conducting these exercises with the Chinese that are quite intimidating for the Japanese, particularly in that part of the world. So I think all of that is an indication that really the US needs to take all of this to the United Nations Security Council. I'm sure that any resolutions would be vetoed by Russia, but there needs to be a discussion in the United Nations that other countries, that are not in Europe, understand what's going on here, and are they willing to turn, to look away if Russia does have some military incursion into Ukraine? What does it mean for their own disputes? So this is more than an issue that just concerns Europe. It does have more global ramifications.
You've argued that all of this is actually part of what you call the Putin Doctrine. What do you mean by that?
So I think the Putin Doctrine is that Putin would like to reverse the post-Cold War settlement. He wants to relitigate it. He would like the rest of the world to treat Russia as if it were the Soviet Union. I don't think he's trying to reconstitute the Soviet Union, but he wants to have dominant influence in those countries that were part of the Soviet Union. And he wants the West to recognize that Russia is a great power, and to say that Russia has a legitimate right to sort of dominate its neighborhood, and maybe even beyond that, since again, what the Russians have included in this proposed treaty is essentially also extending more of their influence to Central Europe. So that is the bottom line of his doctrine. And then I think the ultimate part of that is also to get the United States out of Europe. And again, he sees possibilities at the moment. So it's really to restore Russia to what he believes is its rightful role in the global board of directors.
So literally fracturing the Western alliance is part of his goal?
It definitely is. I mean, it was a Soviet goal, and so it's not something new, but he is now acting on it in a way that he didn't before, and taking advantage again of what he sees are these cracks in the solidarity, the transatlantic solidarity.
So right now, he and Russia have the upper hand?
They definitely do. I mean, think about it. Putin now, since December 17th, has had the US and Europe running around. We've had all these different meetings with Russia, between the US and different European allies. We are responding to his agenda. And that's why, as I said at the beginning, we're now waiting for the latest response. But he has us at the moment, I think, in a place that he wants us to be. We can't answer the question now, are all of these negotiations just a Russian ploy to say, well, you didn't give us what we wanted, and therefore we're going to take action? Or are they genuinely interested in negotiations and diffusing that? We didn't have the answer to that in December. We don't have it yet.
So what do you think the U.S. should be doing differently?
I don't think there's much more that it can do differently. I mean, it has a three-pronged strategy. Diplomacy, we're going to talk to the Russians. Then we're going to, support the Ukrainians as much as we can, improve their resilience, and support their neighbors who might be impacted by this. And then thirdly, threatening all of these massive sanctions to try and deter Russia. We're not going to send US troops there. President Biden has been clear about that. And so there's a limit to what we'll do.
But Angela, there are already U.S. advisors on the ground in Ukraine, and one cannot help but make a comparison to Vietnam. Are we headed for a war in Ukraine?
I don't think we can be headed for that because, the US and Russia are both nuclear superpowers. And if the US got into any kind of direct conflict with Russia, I mean, the consequences could be quite dire. As it is, if there is a military incursion and if there is fighting between Russians and Ukrainians, you could, and there are US advisors that you could have some incident, which could trigger something else. And that, I think, has to give one great cause for concern. But an actual, boots on the ground war with Russia it's unthinkable.
So what do you see happening next?
Well, I mean, I think in the immediate future, the Beijing Olympics, by the way, begin on February the 4th. President Putin is going to there for his first in-person meeting with Xi Jinping since the pandemic began. And, in 2008, when Russia started the war with Georgia, that was at the start of the Beijing Summer Olympics. And the Chinese were not happy about that. And I very much doubt that Russia's going to start any kind of war with Ukraine while the Beijing Olympics are going on. I mean, Putin understands that. China's going to be the only country that's really going to back Russia up if this happens, even though I think the Chinese don't want Russia to go to war. So I think maybe for the next few weeks, you'll see more diplomacy. And I doubt that you'll see de-escalation at the border. And the real question is after that, after the Beijing Olympics are over, if at some point the Russians declare that diplomacy is dead, then I think it doesn't have to be a military incursion. You could have major cyber attacks. There are other things that could be happening. We understand from some reports that, the Russians are also linking up with people in Ukraine who would like to overthrow the government. Who knows what's going to happen there? So you could have things that are short of an actual war, but are extremely destabilizing for Ukraine.
What about the Russian people themselves? Do they know what's going on? Do they support Putin in this latest venture?
So interestingly enough, the latest public opinion poll by the independent polling organization Levada shows that about 50% of Russians blame the United States and NATO for the current crisis. Now, when you get to the question of do they want their sons going and fighting in a war against Ukrainians, we don't have a lot of data on that. But from what we know, even what happened in 2014 when body bags started coming back from Ukraine, the majority of Russians do not want to go to war with Ukraine. They're much less supportive now of that kind of policy than 2014 when Crimea was annexed, that, Putin's popularity ratings got to 80%. And that was wildly, I would say, popular. But we're past that now. And any kind of protracted conflict in which there are casualties with Ukraine, there's no appetite for that in Russia.
I have heard Ukrainians say that the Russians are our brothers and vice versa. So the idea of conflict with people you consider part of your own tribe, I mean, what is this coming to?
Yeah, it's unthinkable. And don't forget, there are lots of mixed marriages in Russia. There are lots of people who have both Ukrainian and Russian heritage. Their families, who've been divided by what's happened up till now. So it wouldn't be, and the Ukrainians don't want to fight the Russians either. They do have a common, complicated shared history, but they don't regard each other as enemies.
Angela Stent, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much, Diane.
That was Angela Stent. She is Senior Non-Resident Fellow at the Brookings Institution and author of Putin's World, Russia Against the West and With the Rest. And that's all for today. We welcome your feedback and suggestions. You can find us on Facebook and Twitter or send us an email, drpodcast@wamu.org. Our theme music is composed by Jim Brunberg and Ben Landsberg of Wonderly. The show is produced by Allison Brody. Our engineer today is Adrian Danhauser. Thanks for listening, all. Be well, stay safe. I'm Diane Rehm.